Well, actually, I'm looking around the room, and I was supposed to introduce who I am, but I'm kind of seeing that the overwhelming majority of you are students, which I'm thrilled about because this lecture is really for you. But for the few of you who don't know me, my name is Mary Ann Benninger, and I'm president of College of St. Benedict. On behalf of the entire College of St. Benedict and St. John's University community, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2012 Renaissance Lecture. I'd like to extend a special welcome to our guest of honor this evening, Dr. Anne Marie Slaughter. We're thrilled to welcome you into our community tonight. I'd also like to thank the College of St. Benedict Institute for Women's Leadership for their co-sponsoring of tonight's event. I established the Renaissance series in 2006 to bring speakers to College of St. Benedict who demonstrate the diversity of opportunities available for women and men, and to encourage women and men to broaden their horizons in every respect, particularly in areas that are less traditional for the respective genders. This is the 7th Renaissance event. Past speakers have included a conservation activist, a space explorer, an Iranian female Iranian space explorer, a photographer, a professor, an economist, and a political analyst. And we're very excited to welcome Dr. Slaughter this year. She exemplifies the qualities that we hope for when we engage a Renaissance speaker. At this time, I'd like to invite student Elizabeth Beatty forward to introduce this evening's speaker. Liz is a St. Ben's junior, majoring in biology with a Spanish concentration, pre-med and physical therapy. She currently serves as the student director of the Institute for Women's Leadership at the College of St. Benedict. She's also involved with the Benedictine Friends and the Student Ambassador Program, and she volunteers at the St. Cloud Hospital Emergency Room with the Student Health Assistant Program. After college, she hopes to attend medical school and hopes of becoming a pediatric emergency room doctor. Please join me in welcoming Liz Beatty.
Hello. Thank you for the introduction. Anne-Marie Slaughter is the Bert G. Kerstetter 1966 University Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. From 2009 to 2011, she served as Director of Policy Planning for the United States Department of State, the first woman to hold that position. Upon leaving the State Department, she received the Secretary's Distinguished Service Award, the highest honor conferred by the State Department, for her work leading the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review. She also received a Emeritus Honor Award from the U.S. Agency for International Development. Dr. Slaughter is a frequent contributor to both mainstream and news media, publishing opinion editorials in major newspapers, magazines, and blogs around the world, and curating foreign policy news to over 8,000 followers on Twitter. She also writes Notes from the Foreign Policy Frontier, a blog for TheAtlantic.com, and appears regularly on CNN, the BBC, NPR, and PBS. She lectures widely and has served on boards of organizations ranging from the Council of Foreign Relations and the New America Foundation to the McDonald's Corporation and the Citigroup Economic and Political Strategies Advisory Group. Foreign Policy magazine named her to their annual list of the top 100 global thinkers in 2009 and 2010. Prior to her government service, Dr. Slaughter was the dean of Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs from 2002 to 2009, where she rebuilt the school's international relations faculty and created a number of new centers and programs. She has written or edited 6 books, including A New World Order and The Idea That Is America, Keeping Faith and Our Values in a Dangerous World, as well as over 100 articles. She was also the convener and academic co-chair of the Princeton Project on National Security, a multi-year research project aimed at developing a new bipartisan national security strategy for the United States. Dr. Slaughter earned a BA from Princeton, an MPhil and a DPhil in International Relations from Oxford, and a JD from Harvard. Tonight, Dr. Slaughter will speak about women and foreign policy, how women-centric policy benefits us all. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Thank you. I can't really imagine a warmer community welcome than the one I've received today, and I'm really delighted to be here. My topic is women in foreign policy, but I was thinking as I went through the day and reflected back on my time in Washington that maybe I should be talking about Minnesotans in foreign policy, because one of the people that I worked most closely with day to day in the State Department was Jake Sullivan, who is a Minnesotan, a very proud Minnesotan. When the Twins were playing, all world foreign policy sort of could come to a crashing halt. So he then succeeded me as the Director of Policy Planning, putting a Minnesotan in a very important position in the State Department. And of course, as I know you know, I worked also closely with Dennis McDonough, a proud St. John's alum. I emailed both of them today to say that I was out here. As befits his impossible schedule, Dennis McDonough has not responded. However, Jake Sullivan said I should tell some Sven and Ole jokes. I don't think I'm going to try to go there, but you should know that Minnesota is very well represented. There's actually a whole Minnesota mafia, but those are the people that I know the best. But I am going to talk to you about women in foreign policy and how having more women in foreign policy would be good for all of us, but also for how working for Hillary Clinton as a woman, as simply an enormously talented Secretary of State who sees the world the way she sees the world, and working with a number of other very talented women has, I think, shifted the direction of American foreign policy in ways that will, again, benefit us all. And then at the end, I want to talk about how women see power and how women lead, and some of the implications that has for the 21st century world. Now, for all of you who are not women in the audience, I often point out, I have two brothers, a father, a husband, and two sons. I have a very important stake in how men and women participate in foreign policy and how all of our policies affect men and women. So I hope you will actually hear this as a statement about American foreign policy and a country that I think is still in the forefront of integrating male and female perspectives, but let's just talk about human perspectives. So the first thing to say is to talk about the very simple fact that there are very few women still in the top ranks of foreign policy. Some of you in Christy Seaver's class, I think, have recently read an article by Micah Zenko that actually goes through this. But I have to tell you, I am still one of the very few women in the room when we are talking about traditional national security issues, whether in Washington or whether at conferences around this country, around the world. Even under this president, and even with a Minnesotan deputy national security advisor, the circles in the White House are still more male than female, very noticeably so. That's not true at the very top level. Obviously, Secretary Clinton, Ambassador Susan Rice, women are well represented. But overall, there are many, many, many fewer women. I mean, I would say there's about 20% women at best, if you're talking traditional foreign policy. And if meaning national security, what we call in international relations, guns and bombs, which maybe as I watch my sons play video games, that should be self-explanatory, but the fact is it's still quite noticeable. If I shift to development, if I talk about conferences on development, again, in Washington or anywhere else, it almost flips. It's probably 60, 70% women and 20, 30% or 30, 40% men. But in traditional foreign policy, there are very few women. And if you look around the world, well, we're actually way ahead of the game. We've had 3 women secretaries of state. Around the world, if you look at the delegations that address major foreign policy issues, that could be nuclear weapons in Iran, that could be North Korea, that could be right now looking at what's happening in Syria and other places in the Middle East. That could be negotiating war and peace anywhere in the world. women are almost never at the table. And that makes a difference. And it makes a difference in some very fundamental ways. It makes a difference in the first instance just because if you are negotiating on behalf of a society, you should represent that society, whether it's men or women or racial composition or ethnic composition or religious composition. We live in a democracy. We believe that representation makes a difference. But it makes a difference in some very specific ways. The conflict in Northern Ireland would not have been resolved but for the women of Northern Ireland deciding they had had enough. And really taking an active role, first of all, in mobilizing public opinion, but then coming to the table and insisting on a deal. And that experience actually led the UN to pass a resolution, the resolution that commits to engaging more women in peace and security around the world. There's a wonderful example in Africa. I think it's between Ethiopia and an Ethiopian neighbor, where there's a long negotiation and going back and forth and back and forth. And finally, one of the women who's at the table, and it's unusual to have women at the table, but one of the women at the table points out that the river that is being negotiated about dried up 7 years ago. Now, this is not, again, I don't want to sort of say, you know, women are for peace and men are for war. It's not nearly so simple. But what is true is that women focus often on different issues. They focus on issues involving families, involving communities, involving the life of the society, often when men are locked into conflicts about honor, conflicts about prestige, conflicts about the very kinds of issues that men are socialized into taking hugely importantly. What we know empirically is that if you have more women at the table, you get different results. Do you always get peace? No, it's not that simple, but you get different results. So just at the very basic level, before we talk about the kinds of issues we focus on, the sorts of things we should do in foreign policy, the fact is that if you think about all the problems in the world and all the conflicts in the world, why on earth should only men be at the table to try to resolve those conflicts? Why shouldn't we have the same diversity that we expect in just about everything we do at this vital, vital, vital table of negotiating an end to conflict? In a number of countries in Africa, women's leadership has been particularly important in rebuilding societies that have been ravaged by conflict. I led a delegation, an all-women delegation to Liberia and Sierra Leone last year. In Liberia, Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, who's a Nobel laureate this year, has been hugely important in helping that country overcome its civil war. And she's actually very comfortable in a way that I think American women might not be, talking about herself as the mother of the society, talking about her role in traditional African society as being seen as being able, and she would say this, I would not. She says, look, I'm able to say things to a lot of the men that they might not take from another man, but they'll take from their mother. And I have to point out, my sons won't take anything from their mother, so this is not a generalizable proposition in my view. However, she definitely builds on the role of women in her particular society and has been very successful. The mayor of Monrovia is this extraordinary woman who lived in New York for 20 years in the Liberian diaspora and was brought back by Ellen Sirleaf Johnson to take over as mayor of this enormous city with almost no infrastructure, tremendous challenges. And the first thing she did was to set about insisting that everybody clean up the trash on the streets. And you can imagine, you know, this is a country that's been through tremendous conflict, very high youth population. You got a lot of teenagers, a lot of teenage guys in particular, sort of hanging out, they're unemployed, and they were not thrilled at the idea of having to pick up the trash. she really insisted. She used a number of techniques to make this a kind of, to provide incentives, and it worked. And as we know, if you think of the broken windows theory in policing, small changes can make a big difference. So the fact that that city is clean, and relative to other capitals I've been to in Africa, it is remarkably clean, was the first step toward building a kind of civic pride. And she has engaged women and men in really starting to rebuild the social fabric of the city. Similarly in Sierra Leone, where again they've had terrible conflict, the First Lady has played an extremely important role, as well as her husband, in focusing on women's issues and bringing together what had been really extraordinarily divided people in conflict. So there is the first point, again, is just to say that having more women at the table makes a difference in foreign policy outcomes. Now let me back up here for a second and be very clear that I am not saying that all women leaders are more pacifist or more gentle. I mean, I think let's just run through some of the women leaders who probably come to mind. Golda Meir, Indira Gandhi, not so much. She imposed the state of emergency in India. She's one very tough lady. Maggie Thatcher, or maybe I should say Meryl Streep. For most of you, you're going to think Meryl Streep, but as tough as you could possibly imagine. My boss, Hillary Clinton, nobody thinks that she's a shrinking violet. Nobody thinks she can't be perfectly tough. So I don't want to suggest that women are kinder and gentler and want peace, not war. Women are perfectly capable of sending troops into war and understanding when you have to fight and fighting themselves. Nevertheless, it is an empirical fact that when you put women at the table, you get a broader set of issues, and often there is room for negotiation, for settlement that there was not before. The one other example I want to give you there, again, I was talking about Northern Ireland. Another great example actually is in Sicily. So this is not an international conflict, but where the conflict with the mafia in Sicily and the mafia and the Italian state was just enormous, and many prosecutors were being shot, judges being shot. It was the women in the end of Palermo who started a movement called Enough, Basta. Right? They put flags, bed sheets out of their windows. They decided they had had enough, that their children were not safe. There was no education, no health care, all the things of a society. They had had enough. That was not enough itself to transform the situation, but it was enough to put an impetus and to basically marshal forces of social change that have indeed made an enormous difference. So that's the first point. Just regardless of what issues you think about or what you might think of what women think or men think or whether you think there's any difference, just get more women at the table. That is in itself is now, as I said, it's the subject of a UN resolution. It's something that Secretary Clinton works very actively toward. There's a global movement. But the second set of issues I want to talk about are how you think about what foreign policy is. And I said already, the traditional foreign policy is guns and bombs. When I studied foreign policy in the 1980s, we were still in the Cold War. And of course, the United States and the Soviet Union had tens of thousands of nuclear weapons pointed at each other. It was a very important thing to worry about, guns and bombs. I mean, we were in a situation where we literally could have blown ourselves up and taken the world with us. And of course, it was also a world much closer to World War II and the Vietnam War. These were extremely important issues, and they remain extremely important issues. But the way that then shaped what you study and what you do in foreign policy was you thought about, well, either defense or diplomacy. So you could be on the hard side or the more softer side, but still negotiating, often with coercive power, economic sanctions, or actual military force. That's still very important, and I would say about half of Secretary Clinton's time at the State Department was indeed focused on, again, issues like North Korea or Iran, or various conflicts around the world, or even thinking about rising powers like China or India or the sort of shift in power in the world and how we're going to deal with that. But Secretary Clinton came into office saying there are three pillars. There's defense, there's diplomacy, and there's development. Development is every bit as important to address the problems we face as defense or diplomacy. So let me step back and just give you a sense of her nightly reading, or anybody these days who's thinking about global problems. It's not a very comforting list. Start with proliferation of nuclear weapons, or for that matter, biological weapons. Then think about terrorism, and think about the two of those together. That's plenty of nightmares just right there. But then think about the arc of conflict, which I used to say Israel to India. Probably now I could say across North Africa, potentially to India. Obviously, Israel, Palestine, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and all the way. How are we going to actually resolve those conflicts over the long term? But then think about global pandemics, or climate change, or resource scarcity. Those are issues, if your definition of what to worry about is something that could kill millions of Americans or fundamentally change our lives, those are every bit as important. There was this one week in May 2009, we were sitting around at the early morning meeting with the secretary and the deputy secretaries and various other people in the State Department. On Monday, the Pakistani Taliban were within 100 miles of Islamabad. That was very bad. We were very worried, and it looked like the Pakistani government was simply going to cave, was going to negotiate yet another settlement. So we're all thinking about that. And on Tuesday, the news in the Washington Post was we were heading for a double-dip global recession, which, of course, you'd say, well, we're the State Department, we're not the Treasury, but when the world economy tanks, just about everything we have to focus on gets much, much worse, right? If you just think about the Arab revolutions right now and how much the economy plays a role. So that was Tuesday. Wednesday, the H1n1 virus broke out in Mexico. And we didn't know whether that was aerosol-borne or not. And the day that one of those bird viruses, or in this case it was a pig virus, is aerosol-borne, I don't know how many of you have seen Contagion, but it's pretty realistic. I mean, it's sort of one of the oldest fears in the world, that your children, your family could be ill and there's not a cure, and it causes unbelievable social disruption in 1 week. Now, all of those issues had at least some important development part. The H1n1 global pandemics, that's almost all about development. And it is, we can have treaties, we can have the World Health Organization, but fundamentally we are only as secure as the state of a health system in Western China or the Philippines or Indonesia. And it's got to be on the ground. We can negotiate with that government, but unless you are changing behavior in those villages, in those provinces, in terms of identifying the virus, being able to then actually communicate, not communicate it in the sense of a disease, but communicate that it is there, you're not going to actually be safer. That's the work of development. That's the people on the ground who are trying to improve health systems. If you think about the Pakistani Taliban, well, why are the Pakistani Taliban being supported? Well, there are many reasons. There's certainly a religious reason, but there's also a development reason. These are people who are largely in provinces that have very, very little. The tribe has far more power than the state. They're not getting education. They're not getting health care. They're not getting a basic livelihood. And that helps fuel all sorts of conflict and radicalization generally. So long term, and these are longer term solutions, you are not going to address this by any number of drones. I'm sorry. We could kill off probably the entire current Pakistani Taliban leadership. They will just come back. unless we change the underlying social conditions. And the global economy, well, you know, our best hope for making sure our economy is strong is actually seeing that all the emerging economies, and I don't just mean China and India and Brazil and Turkey and Indonesia, I mean all of Africa and in our own hemisphere, Latin and Central America, if those are strong economies, we will be doing far better. They will ultimately be buying our products and services. And that, indeed, President Obama's development policy is premised in no small part on the importance of having strong developing economies for our own economy. So those three issues, critical issues, diplomacy is important, defense is important, but development is every bit as important. And one of the things that Secretary Clinton has pushed enormously strongly, and President Obama very much also, has been this idea that we have to focus on the people as well as the governments. We have to focus on development as well as diplomacy. There are certainly plenty of men doing wonderful development work, but I have to tell you that this part of the agenda would not have been advanced nearly as strongly if it were not for Secretary Clinton and for many of the women in high places who feel passionately about this. Again, Raj Shah is the 36-year-old head of USAID. He's a doctor. He worked for the Gates Foundation. He's absolutely wonderful. But if, as I said at the outset, if you take a group of national security people, it'll be 80% men, 20% women. If you take a development group, it's likely to be the reverse. We need a foreign policy where both those things are equally true. Just a couple of other points on not just development, but more broadly, what I would call a pivot to the people. So many of you, if you've studied international relations, you'll have read about the pivot to Asia. There's been a lot about the pivot to Asia. Secretary Clinton wrote an article in Foreign Policy talking about the pivot to Asia, and effectively what we're saying is we're going to stop fighting in Iran, in Iraq, and I hope we're not going to start fighting in Iran, but we can talk about that in question period, and in Afghanistan, and we are going to focus more of our resources on Asia as a whole, because when people look back 100 years from now, what they're going to see is less the particular conflicts in Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere else. They're going to see the rise of this enormous part of the world. The pivot to Asia gets a lot of newspaper headlines. Equally important is a pivot to the people. And that doesn't get newspaper headlines because it's not nearly as sort of immediate or sexy. It's a longer-term perspective. Focusing on development is focusing on people. As I said, it's focusing not on the state, but the people within the state. But Secretary Clinton sees that much more broadly across the board. And one way to think about this is the classic way that you learn international relations is that states are like billiard balls. This is a term by a great international relations scholar, Arnold Wolfer. He said, states collide with each other in the international system like billiard balls. And if you think about, a bipolar system or a multipolar system, you're sort of thinking about these entities, that like billiard balls. When you focus on people, the billiard ball idea is a billiard ball is opaque. You can't see through it. You don't think about the people within it. This is a view that is much more about, yes, there are governments, but there are also people. You saw this last week when Secretary Clinton was at the UN General Assembly and she was speaking. She was speaking to the Syrian people. She was not speaking to the government. She was saying to the Syrian people directly, we are with you. We are standing with you. Your bravery inspires us. We are in awe of what you are trying to do. She was also saying, do not fall into sectarian violence. War is not the way out. That may not yet be a diplomatic solution, may not be possible, but what she was doing is what she does whenever she travels. She has all the government-to-government meetings, and then she has a meeting like this one, a town hall with students, with civil society activists, with women. She tweets, she blogs. Our embassies are increasingly reaching out to broad sections of the population. This isn't just public relations. She has put in place a set of policies that mean if you go into the Foreign Service today, increasingly you will be focusing not on engaging the government, but engaging the people. So things like a youth strategy. And that seems actually kind of obvious, 60% of the Middle East is under the age of 30. They think differently than their parents. If we are going to think about how we're going to advance American interests in the Middle East, we ought to be thinking about how you talk to young people. But that is not traditional diplomacy, because the billiard ball, you don't think about who's in the state, you think about government-to-government relations. Or a women's strategy. She appointed Ambassador Milan Verveer as the Ambassador for Global Women's Issues, who's done an enormous amount of work on empowering women around the world in terms of everything from women entrepreneurs to something called the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves. Now here, I say cook stoves. This is not diplomacy, right? Cook stoves? Are you kidding? I mean, diplomacy is eyeball to eyeball, and the other guy just blinked. No. Cook stoves are really important. Inefficient cook stoves are huge sources of carbon emissions, and these are billions of people cooking around using these cook stoves. They are terrible for global health. Think about secondhand smoke in this country. In New York, you can't even smoke outside anymore. People are so worried about secondhand smoke. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I'm just thinking we are so fixated on the idea that, if you're next to somebody who smokes a cigarette, imagine being a family of 8 in a small hut all around a wood cook stove. And just think what that does. 2 million deaths a year directly related to wood cook stoves. And finally, if you are a woman, it's your job to get the wood. And in many of these places, the wood nearby is long gone, and you have to go farther and farther to get wood. And in unstable places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo or Somalia or Kenya or any of the fragile states, when women are raped and murdered, it's typically when they are out finding wood. So efficient cook stoves that can operate either on wood or on many other kinds of fuel, if you can get efficient cook stoves, you're fighting global warming, you're fighting you're improving global health, and you're improving women's security. The State Department launched a Alliance for Global Clean Cook Stoves. It now has 225 partners, governments, large corporations, foundations, Dow Corning, Shell, Morgan Stanley, the UN Foundation. Their goal is to get the adoption of 100 million efficient cook stoves by 2020 and to build markets around those cook stoves so that women and men can sell them in communities and improve their economy as well as their health and carbon emissions. That's a focus on the people. That's a strategy that focuses on women and families. In another example, focusing on entrepreneurs. If you think about improving relations with the Muslim world, one of the things we know is that no matter what people in many Muslim-majority countries think of the United States as a government, they admire our technology, they admire our science, and they admire our entrepreneurship. We created a global entrepreneurship initiative where President Obama invited a couple of hundred young entrepreneurs from all over the Middle East and other countries, but primarily the Middle East, to the White House. We connected them up with Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, with venture capitalists, with angel investors, with people who know how to create the entire ecosystem of entrepreneurship that we somewhat take for granted in many parts of this country. We then have done that country by country, in Egypt, in Pakistan, again, thinking about parts of a society rather than thinking just about the government. And the last example may be particularly relevant to Minnesota because we've just been talking about the large diaspora communities here of Hmong and Somalis and others, thinking about a diaspora strategy. The State Department for a long time thought about diasporas as very annoying groups who were constantly pushing on us to change our policy toward whatever the government was that many of these people had fled. And that's inevitable in all countries, but refugees from a country obviously feel very strongly politically. But now we're starting to see diasporas as huge advantages of people who are tied back to their home country and can tie us to that country. So as I said, when I was in Liberia and Sierra Leone, the number of people who were helping to rebuild those countries who had been in the United States, often for 10, 15 years during the war, who were now coming back, who were creating businesses, and those businesses were tied back to the businesses they had created while they were here. If we're thinking about America and the world, why wouldn't we be thinking about how to mobilize all of our immigrant communities, and ultimately we're all from immigrant communities, all of our recent immigrant communities, tying them back to their home countries as an asset for the United States. So that's a pivot to the people. The last thing I'll say on that score is a tremendous emphasis on technology, because for the first time in human history, it is theoretically possible to communicate with every human being on the face of the earth who is old enough to operate a cell phone. In theory, every human being who has a cell phone could get a text message from the US government. We're kind of a ways from that in practice, but that's an incredible change, right? We are now able to actually connect with people through text messaging, through Twitter, through Facebook, through all different kinds of social media directly. And we're also capable of providing technology that allow people to connect with each other and with knowledge. So the State Department runs an Apps for Africa competition in which young Africans, or Americans, but it's mostly young Africans, submit applications for the best apps, and the State Department judges them and issues a prize. Now, this is one where many traditional members of our Foreign Service don't really think we've lost our minds, but the winning app was an app developed in Kenya that helps you know when your cow has ovulated. This is very important if you are a farmer in Kenya. You can understand why. We run this competition every year. We looked at it. There was a first prize, second, and third prize. We then found the funding to make this app available. In Russia, we have Text for Baby. You all are too young, and I'm glad to know that, but for those of us who've been pregnant, I can't imagine having gotten through my pregnancies without something called What to Expect When You're Expecting, which basically tells you every week what you should be feeling, experiencing. And when you're a new mother, that is really, or frankly, my husband was pretty interested too. When you're new parents, you can now do that by cell phone. Right? You can send a text that says, if you are a month pregnant, this is what you should be eating. If you are experiencing any of the following symptoms, you should get to a clinic. That's one example. There are now cell phone technologies that can provide tremendous sort of diagnostic help for women, families, communities in very far-flung villages, and can also collect epidemiological data of a kind we couldn't get before, because it's a two-way communication. We lead technology delegations in the State Department that bring together people from Twitter, from Google, from lots of startup tech companies, together with NGOs, with governments, with business in countries around the world to make these connections. That's a very exciting kind of diplomacy, but it requires a focus on the people. All right. So I've been talking about the very concrete, getting more women at the table, focusing on people, focusing on development, perspectives that I think come very naturally to women. Now I want to talk about power and leadership. When I was a law student in 1982, I read a book called In a Different Voice. It's a book by Carol Gilligan. And she did a great deal of work on how 13-year-old girls and 13-year-old boys think about moral issues and really think about the world and their own place in it. And what she came up with was that boys are much more likely to see the world in terms of a hierarchy, in terms of a ladder. And if you see the people around you and their relationships to one another, think about the bullies in middle school, because I've got a son in middle school, you're thinking about it as a hierarchy, you want to be on the top, or as close to the top as you can get, because that's a position of power, of safety, of security. Girls saw the world much more in terms of a web. think about a spider web, or think about the internet, the World Wide Web. If you think about the world in terms of a web, and again, think about middle school, that's where 13, 14-year-olds are. Think about all the relationships and the complicated cliques and all of that you may have been part of. If you think about the web, you don't want to be at the top. There is no top of a web. You want to be at the center. You want to be the person who's most connected to everybody else, who has the most friends, or who has the most sources of information, or who is a member of the most different groups, so you can broker between them. Both are kinds of power, and the world certainly has both. There are plenty of hierarchies, but there are also more and more webs. Now, when I read this, it was just a revelation. I mean, I was 25, long way from middle school, but it just finally made sense to me how I saw the world, how I thought about where I wanted to be. I was not it's not that I wasn't interested in power, but how I thought about power was not being at the top. But I always felt that it was important to be at the center. Both of those kinds of power exist. I think it is true that women are more likely to get the web sort of vision, although they're certainly capable of thinking about hierarchies, and we've got many of women who are at the top of hierarchies, and vice versa. There are plenty of men who think about it in terms of the center of things. But it means leadership is very different. If you are at the top of a hierarchy, leadership is about command. You tell people what to do. Think about the military. It's one of the great things about the military. Actually, I love it when I've got many friends in the military. And, they say, do this, and the person below them does this. This is, again, the parent of teenagers. I would do a lot for that kind of power. I don't have it. So the first thing you do is command. If you can't command, you set agendas. And that, boy, if you've been in a bureaucracy, or if you're the leader of any organization, you know how to do this. You set the agenda. And you say there are three options, and one is terrible and the other's terrible, and people choose your option, which is the one in the middle. Or if you're a parent, you say, would you like to go to computer camp or theater camp? Not going to camp is not on the table. You structure choices. So that's the second way you exercise power in a hierarchy. And the third way is more subtle, but it's still coercive in the sense you basically shape people's preferences. You use culture, you use peer pressure, you sort of create an environment where people want what you want. They're not always aware that you're exercising that power, but you are doing it quite deliberately often, because that's how you can get them to do what you want. And again, you have to know how to do all those things, whether you're a man or a woman. But if you're operating in a web, you can't do any of that. Command makes no sense. You cannot command somebody who is horizontal to you, who is in a web relationship. Instead, you have to mobilize. So if you're trying to get something done, think about a social movement, or think about trying to get something done on this campus. Perhaps you want to tell the president you want different food or something. No, not different food. I've heard the food is great. Well, so she's already succeeded in that regard. We'll stop there. But think about what you do is you mobilize people. You get them excited about something. You bring them together. That's the first thing you do. The second thing you do is you cannot set the agenda for them, but you can connect them you can connect them to each other and to a common mission. And that's how you exercise that kind of leadership. You bring people together, you get them excited about a common purpose, and you sort of orchestrate what then becomes an organized movement or society or project, because you could do this, think about a volunteer project. And the last thing, and this is more subtle but very important, I said if you're at the top of a hierarchy, you shape preferences. If you're in a web, you can't shape preferences unless you're willing to have your own preferences changed. If I want to persuade you of something, I'm looking at Hannah, if I want to persuade you of something, and you realize very quickly that I'm not going to have my own mind changed, that all I'm really interested in doing is making you do what I want, you'll shut down. If you sense that you can persuade me, that I'm actually listening to you and I'm prepared to change what I think, I'm much more likely to get you to change what you think within parameters. So leadership in a web, You got to mobilize, you got to connect, you got to orchestrate, and you've got to be much more open about having your own preferences changed. It's a very different style of leadership. Again, both are very important. I think it is broadly true that women are more comfortable with the second style than the first, but again, that may be a function of society more than biology. I see no reason why it should be biological. But here's my last point. Wherever you think these differences come from, the fact is we are more and more in a world of webs, in a world of networks, in a flat world. Remember Thomas Friedman, right? We can't control what other people do. We can't do it as countries. And we got 200 countries out there, and a lot of them are very strong, and even the ones that aren't are perfectly capable of saying no. And when we need their votes or we need them to act, we have to persuade them. We are in a world in which every corporate, every corporation, all the corporate management leadership you read, it's all about moving from hierarchy to networks. Because we've got supply chains, we've got coalitions, you've got to be able to bring people together. And of course, just think about the web. I mean, that is the world we increasingly live in, and it's a world where sharing does more for you than command, where connecting people, convening people, orchestrating networks, orchestrating coalitions, those are the terms of the 21st century world. And in that world, I think women are enormously advantaged in all sorts of ways. Those kinds of skills, that way of seeing the world, is an approach that is only going to become more and more valuable. Women need to learn sort of hierarchical command and vice versa, and ultimately we all need to learn to think this way. But I'll just close by saying the 21st century is a very good place for women in foreign policy. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
I hope we have time
I do,
for some questions.
Absolutely.
And we have microphones on either side.
Yes.
Doctor, could you address the Arab Spring and the opportunities and threats that entails?
Enough about webs and hierarchies and women, and let's get down to the Arab Spring. Fair point, fair question. So the question, for those of you who might not have heard it, is a very narrow question about the Arab Spring and the threats and opportunities. So the first thing to say is I find it, just at the level of the human spirit, to be an extraordinary and ultimately uplifting time. I think of it the way I felt in 1989 when I watched millions of people who had lived under communist government actually demanding the rights and the dignity that all of us want. And what you see most fundamentally is people who are saying, enough. I want to be able to have a better life. I want a better life for my children. I want to participate in my government. I want not to be tortured if I oppose the government. I want freedom of speech. I want freedom of assembly. I want universal rights. And that, I think, we have to keep sight of. And over time, those waves of democratization have succeeded in adding substantially to the numbers of democracies in the world, although rarely uniformly. So first in Latin America in the 70s, and then in Eastern Europe in the 90s, and now across the Middle East, we can expect that overall that will be a good thing in the sense of the number of people who will live under a government that is representative. There will be many more. We can also expect that some of those countries won't make it, and that they are likely to have somewhat what we've seen in Russia, a period of democratization followed by chaos, followed by a strongman, followed by maybe a much more gradual period of reform, or maybe the need for another revolution. And what you're seeing right now in Egypt, to me, is very much, are they going to make it, or is there going to be anarchy, and is the desire of ordinary people for stability, which is very important, going to reassert itself, and you'll have a strongman. So that's I was talking about focusing on the people. That's the human dimension, and I do think ultimately that's the most important dimension. But then there's the question of, okay, now let's look at the geopolitical. We are the United States. We are closely allied with Israel. We worry about Israel's security. We need oil, and that's where a huge amount of it comes from. We have enormous interest in the sense that we are based there. Our Fifth Fleet is there. We have troops based in various places. What is this going to mean for our geopolitical interests in the short to medium term? And that's a much, much harder question. And for 30 years, we answered that question in terms of we want a government that will do what we want or be our friend and do what we want some of the time, even though we know it can't last. And we made that trade-off. We did it very deliberately. We knew these governments were repressing their people, and we knew sooner or later that was going to blow up. But every president thought, next president's watch. Well, easier for me to just keep the status quo. Interestingly, George W. Bush is the first president to try to break that, right? He came in, obviously, with the invasion of Iraq, which was not the way I think it should have happened, but he really came in saying, we need long-term stable democracies in this region, and Condi Rice went to Cairo just like Barack Obama did and said, we stand for democracy across the region. Then Hamas had its elections, and Hamas won, and we cooled our enthusiasm very rapidly. But we knew that this couldn't last. And so now we're in this situation where we know over 10 years we have to let this process play out. But we also know that in the next 2, 5, 8 years, we're likely to get governments that really are going to be much harder to deal with and much harder for Israel to deal with. I personally don't think that the Egyptian government, whatever it is, will break the peace with Israel. I think economically that would be disastrous. But they're certainly not going to support Israel in various ways. They're going to make it tougher. Who knows what could happen in Syria? And if you got, as I hope you will, get some kind of representative government, you could very easily kind of get a Sunni Islamist bloc. Now, when I say Islamist, I just mean political Islam, meaning in the same way that you have the Christian Democrats in many countries in Europe. I do not think that means that they're radical in any way, but I do think it means they are going to be much less likely to be favorable to a number of our policies. So it's going to be a really bumpy road. I think long term, and I would say even in the medium term, our best bet is still to stand with the people as much as we can. And again, that's because demographically, the people under 30 will win. They have to. I mean, they may not win this time, but they're going to win in 10 years. We have to basically convince that generation that we mean what we say. And only if we do that can we resolve the longer term problems that have resulted from the Islamic radicalization, terrorism, but also simply hatred of the United States that we see across that region. Yeah. And I think you need to wait for a mic? Oh, I see. Oh, you got the mic. All right. The person who gets the mic gets to speak. You get the next mic.
Back to the web versus hierarchy, you mentioned there being only a web and only the hierarchy. Is there such thing as a hybrid system? And if so, what would that look like in the 21st century in foreign policy?
I'm glad you asked that question. So absolutely, and I should have said, every system is actually a combination of both. To some extent. So Wikipedia, Wikipedia is always the example of the web and the leaderless, collaborative, 21st century coming together. Wikipedia has 50 people who work for it, and it's a hierarchy. There's a boss, Jimmy Wales is the boss, and there are people who have, jobs like in a more regular hierarchical position, and they make all the rest of that possible. And similarly, I would say, even in the most hierarchical organizations, take the military, you increasingly have the awareness that you have to be more web-like because you need to know what everybody in your organization knows. And if your privates are terrified to speak up the chain, you're not going to know it. So I was just at the Naval War College, and we were talking about the new naval strategy, and I was talking about the power of Twitter and how if I'm often when I'm at a conference now with lots of young teched up people, I'll have a Twitter feed behind me. So I'm talking, and people in the audience are tweeting, and some of them are saying, boy, she's full of it. And I'm fortunately not seeing that behind me, but others in the audience are responding. And it's incredibly democratizing because actually there are a bunch of people in any audience who know a lot about what the speaker's talking about. And ultimately, you're empowering them to speak. If you put together what the speaker said and the Twitter feed, you get a much richer, much more valuable set of insights and information. So even the military is realizing we better figure out how to learn what we know, and that too has a web combination. So I would say the way to ask the question is, what's the percentage in any organization? What are the kinds of organizations that need to be more web with small hierarchy, and what are the organizations that need to be more hierarchy and less web? Again, I deal with this as a parent all the time. Yes?
After hearing your speech, I'm curious to know, what do you think the U.S. foreign policy should be in regards to Syria?
All right, well, so for those of you who are in Christie's class, you heard me on this, and I will try to keep it short. So, you know, ideally, if I could wave my magic wand, the Arab League plan would be accepted, and you would Bashar al-Assad would hand off to his vice president, who is fully a member of his party and a loyalist, but nevertheless, that person would then help convene a unity government, and you'd move toward elections. Essentially, you'd have a version of what's happened in Egypt. And I still think there's a small chance that could happen. There are reports, and it's hard to know how to credit them, that actually the regime is much weaker than it looks, that actually the army is caving in on itself, that defections are increasing, and that if people thought they could defect without being shot, many, many, many more would defect. So there's some suggestion that if we just keep the pressure on, it's going to implode. And in fact, then you would get this acceptance of that plan. I think I probably give that 10%, 15% chance. So then you have the choice between arming the opposition and pushing for some kind of military intervention. If I had to bet on what will happen, I would say we're going to arm the opposition, and there's going to be a really long and bloody and horrific civil war, and the government is going to be brutal beyond belief. I mean, what we're seeing in Homs is going to happen city after city. He's got tanks, he's got planes, he's got mortars. Even if we arm these guys, these are not, I mean, many are defectors, but this is hardly a highly trained military. These are, like in Libya, pretty disorganized groups, and of course, millions of civilians. Syria is a country of 22 million people. That's a lot of people, and it's going to be awful. But if I had to bet, I think that's probably what most people will default to, and indeed it's what we wanted to do in Libya, and people like me said this will be terrible, and not just for the war, but afterwards you're going to have weapons everywhere, you're going to have a militarized society, it's going to be terrible. I think we should be pushing for an intervention led by Turkey and the Arab League that would create safe zones along the borders of Jordan and Turkey. Unlike the safe zones in Bosnia, they will actually be connected to relatively free countries. So it's not going to be like an enclave that can be overrun. It will mean that if it does get overrun, people will just refugee into Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon or other countries. But it would have the advantage of obviously protecting civilians, but it would also have the advantage of saying to those who want to defect in the Syrian army, hey, just get across our border and you're safe, right? And I think we'd see far more defection under that circumstance. I also think it would bring home to those people who are still supporting Assad that if they don't switch now, they're going to be on the losing end. And I think that's important too, that you have to convince them that Assad his days are numbered. Otherwise, you don't get the political shift that will make it easier. You know, the Obama administration, as of yesterday, was canvassing military options, but we can't do it ourselves. It has to be led by Turkey, by Saudi Arabia, by Qatar, by Jordan, by the UAE, and we can support them, but we cannot lead. If we send in troops, al-Assad is saying this is a foreign conspiracy to overturn me, and if we send in troops, everybody will say, yep, this is a foreign conspiracy. So we have to get them to lead, but we have to be able to support, in my view. Which I'm writing everywhere I can, but you know. Next question, there in the back.
First off, thank you for coming to speak to us. This past summer, I was in a small question and answer section with Ambassador Patterson before she headed to Egypt, and there were a couple questions. It was mostly about policy, but a couple questions about women in American foreign policy. And maybe this was an incorrect perception, but she seemed sort of loath to talk about that. And I was wondering, in American foreign policy, do you feel they need to be more conscious of what they can bring to the table as women, or do you think that's just sort of inherent?
I don't think the problem's with the women. I mean,
No. Just, do you feel that women, like in the State Department or in foreign embassies, do you feel that when they approach issues, they're fully conscious of how can I approach this and bring something unique as a woman? Or is it just sort of inherent that they come to it that way?
okay, so it's a good question. And you know, Ambassador Patterson's one of our best. She's been ambassador to Pakistan. She's now ambassador to Egypt. She's absolutely terrific. It is still a fact we have not had a woman ambassador to France, to England, to Germany, to China, to Russia. All right? That's the big five, right? It's 2012, folks. We've had 3 women secretaries of state. We've never had a woman ambassador to any of the permanent members of the Security Council. So we still have a long way to go. And the Foreign Service has changed a lot. Somebody was saying it's 50-50 at the lower ranks, but and the reason I emphasize this goes to your question, and I talked to a group of women about this today. You will not get women talking the way I just talked unless you have a critical mass of women in the room. If I were not talking to you about women in foreign policy, and if this room were mostly men, I'd be talking guns and bombs. I know how to do that, and I would do that because that's the only way I'm going to get any credibility. And if there were 2 women in the room, or 10% women in the room, we're all going to be like that. It's only when you get to a critical mass of women, and this is true in reverse, right? If men are in a group where it's all women, boy, you guys are the greatest feminists on earth. But, you know, it's only, I mean, and I mean this really, where men and women genuinely have different perspectives on things, you're not going to put forward your perspective if it's all the other gender, or if you're blacks and whites or any kind of group like that. So the problem is that I think, in my experience, women know very well what they could be bringing to the table and what they'd like to say, but they are generally constrained by what is still a much more male culture. And until we really, that's why I say in the end, you just gotta up the numbers. And if you do, I think, A, you'll get women speaking out differently. I actually also think you'll get a lot of men who may well agree with them, but who are not about to challenge the prevailing culture. I'm out of government, right? Yeah.
Yes, I'm just curious from a bit of a more theoretical perspective. I see America as a hegemonic power, at least it has been in recent years. Do you think it's important to kind of taper off that ladder as opposed to just going directly to the web system that you talked about? Or what is the timeline that you see for transitioning to that web system?
So America's in a really interesting position because, yes, we are relatively less powerful. There's no question. We have to be. I mean, you know, when you were sort of where we were in 1945 and where we were in 1990s, there was only one place to go but down relative to other countries coming up. So there's no shame in that. We are still, though, an incredibly central nation. And one way to think about this is lots of nations dislike us, but they dislike some other nation more. So the Mexicans really often don't like us at all, but they sure like us better than they like the Brazilians. And similarly, if you look at India and Pakistan, or in Africa, lots of countries may not like us, but they like us better than they like Nigeria or South Africa or whoever the local big country is, which means we have enormous leverage. We are often country's second choice. And in Asia particularly, I was just yesterday at the U.S.-Singapore Strategic Dialogue, and the former head of the Singaporean Civil Service, who's a very smart guy, the Singaporeans and everybody else in Southeast Asia want us there. They don't want us fighting with China, and they don't want to choose between us and China. They have no interest in doing that, but boy, do they want us there. And the more China pushes, the more they want us there. So even in the kind of more traditional geopolitical world, we can trade on our ability to be an honest broker, to bring different nations together, again, who may not love us, but we are the second choice. We can bring nations together who won't talk to each other otherwise. And if we think about our power that way, that's kind of web-like power, but at the level of nations, I think we're incredibly well placed. And I just think it's the fact that we keep trying to figure out who's on top prevents us from seeing all the assets that we actually have. Yes.
I feel like we need a woman to ask
I was wondering.
I'll take that honor. I'm wondering, we have a lot of women, female college students in the room. We have a lot of people who have opportunities to mentor female college students in the room. Could you give me a piece of advice as a woman on a college campus, on a women's college campus that can mentor women, on what can I do to help build leadership in women, to help get women to ask questions, to help get women at the table?
Okay, so that's a great question. So the first thing is, you've got to tell every woman in this audience should have had her hand raised. I'm sorry. It's over and over and over again. I'm sorry, I don't want to put people on the spot, but I literally I do this in my classes. Women's voices have to be heard, and yet you got to basically make yourself do it. I was telling people at lunch that until I was 35, I was so terrified of public speaking, I was ready to, my hands shook, my body shook. I just hated public speaking, which I'm sure none of you believe, but it's really true. You just got to make yourself do it. Second, you have to basically you can actually learn a lot from the men around you. My husband is a very strong, assertive professor of international relations, and he's 6'6", so he's very strong and very assertive. And he taught me a lot about how to basically be much more confident in the same way that men learn to be confident. I mean, I think most of the men in this room would probably agree that they're not 100% secure all the time, but how they learn to deal with insecurity is very different than the way women learn to deal with insecurity. They don't apologize. On the contrary, a man who's insecure is often a little more assertive, right? He kind of, puts himself out there because that's a better way not to be challenged. Women tend to say, I don't really know whether this is a good question, or, well, I'm not sure if I know very much about this, or I'm not an expert, but, well, now who's going to take you seriously if you run yourself down? You have to learn to basically to take yourself as seriously as you want other people to take you. And these are not easy things. These are, I grew up in the South, and I still, when I first started tweeting and doing things, I still have this instinct of, ooh, I shouldn't brag. Shouldn't put yourself forward. It's very deep in our society, but ultimately, for all these wonderful women and for the men who are going to be their husbands and fathers and all of that, we will be a much healthier society when women have the same sense of their value and their confidence that men do. So raise your hands, ladies.
I had it up a little bit before.
Sorry.
I have a question, and I think it pertains, I think, to a lot of our female students here as well. What advice do you have for students who hope to go into diplomacy, who as stakeholders in the peace process, as representatives, etc.? What is it that they need to do? Or is it a matter of time, as you suggest? Is it generational that we're going to take to get this old body, this old mindset out of the way to allow women to get to the table? What do you suggest that women do?
Okay.
To actually become a
on behalf of all old fogies everywhere, I would not be here if it were not for a number of very important men in my life. And indeed, Robert Cohan, who's the husband of Nan Cohan, who was the president of Duke, has single-handedly mentored more women in political science than anybody else, who's transformed the face of American political science. My mentors in law school, my mentors growing up were almost all men, now more women. So I do think this actually has to be men and women working together, but I think women have to be willing to push. I mean, I know for this generation, the idea of being feminist is not comfortable, and I actually think that's the success of the feminist movement, that that's true, right? That you should feel that you are entitled to the same things that men have. But it means we're less willing as a society to point out the obvious. I mean, you have not heard many people stand up there and say they're only 20% women in foreign policy and that's a problem. It is a problem, and women and men, and honestly, again, I've found many men who want to change this as much as women want to change this. You've got to be able to say it. You've got to be able to name it. If we don't name it as a problem, it's not going to change. And if we don't name more broadly, and this is the second thing I would say, we need to change as a society so that men and women, all of you out there, all of you students who want to have families and careers, you're only going to be able to do that, and only to be able to be fully engaged parents in the way my husband and I are both fully engaged parents, if society changes much more broadly for both of us, for both genders, that your bosses will let you say, you know, for the next, I'm having a baby, we're having a baby, I need time, I need flex time, I need to be able to I'm not going to take a job that requires more travel for this period, but then after that, of course, I will. There should be ways to allow people to do much more at home, men or women, in terms of technology, all things that are doable, but fundamentally, men and women have to say, we really want to change the numbers, we got to change the society, we got to change the value system. Look at who we value. We value the people who are, you know, in their careers 100%. We're not valuing the people who are stepping down to take care of their kids. The Deputy Secretary of State and the Deputy Secretary of Defense, both men, both stepped down after 2 years because they had, when the Deputy Secretary of Defense had just adopted a second child from Russia, and he knew he couldn't keep in that job with his kid, and the Deputy Secretary of State has 2 adopted daughters who are heading into, well, I guess they're 10 and 12, and he said, you know, I've done it just the way I said I've done it, but now I need to go back to my kids. Or Michelle Flournoy, who's number 3 at the Defense Department, said it. Why aren't we admiring those people for what they're doing? Because we care, as not as men and women, but as parents, as human beings, about being able to balance work and family. So we've got a lot of work to do, but the first thing to do is to name the problem, and then we can change it. Okay. Ah. Yes.
Okay. I just more of a practical question, but you know, so as a college student, as a political science major with your crafting learning focus, like once you graduate from college, what kind of things could you potentially get into in terms of jobs, in terms of ways to get into the international relations kind of, you know, business?
Great last question. So the good news is there are more opportunities than ever before, in part because there are more parts of society, parts of the economy that are more engaged than ever before. So you can do international policy issues in the private sector, you can do it in the nonprofit sector, and of course you can do it in the government sector. When I came out of school, it was mostly government, and if you weren't going to be in the State Department, you weren't going to be doing it. Now you can work for an NGO doing just about anything. You can start your own doing just about anything and connect to others. You can work in the private sector, and to start with, you should learn the rules of the private sector. I mean, you don't go into the private sector saying, hey, I'd like to do climate change and I want to come work for Exxon. But on the other hand, what I was saying is a huge part of where we're going in foreign policy is public-private partnerships. So again, yesterday I heard the Assistant Secretary for East Asia and the Pacific, Kurt Campbell, talking about what he's most proud of is 15 public-private partnerships that he's created with corporations. Now, they range from things like sending 3,000 dogwoods back to Japan. You know, the Japanese sent us the cherry trees that are around the tidal basin in Washington. We're sending dogwoods back, and we'll plant them around where the earthquake zone was, and some in Tokyo. That's entirely privately funded. He organized it working with corporations and foundations to kind of make that happen, to a program called 100,000 Strong, where we're going to try to send 100,000 students, or to have 100,000 students in China at any one moment learning English, again, being funded by corporations, to the sort of thing I was talking about with cook stoves, where corporations are actively working on a global problem. That could be health, that could be water. Coca-Cola spends a lot of time thinking about water management and purified water, because it has to. So you can be in a business and think about a set of policy issues you care about and work with your corporation to do that. You can do that in a nonprofit, you can do it in a university or a think tank or any kind of, you can do it in a church group in terms of we start talking about development. There are many, many, many civic groups involved. You can do it in federal government, but equally importantly, you can do it in state or local government. One of the offices I didn't talk about is the State Department created an office for global intergovernmental affairs. And I thought, well, I thought that was the State Department, was global intergovernmental affairs. But in fact, it's an office that reaches out to state and city government, because I assure you that the governor of Minnesota leads trade delegations. I'm fairly certain, I think it's the Minnesota National Guard has a partnership with the National Guards, with countries, some countries in Africa, most National Guards do. Increasingly, on the environment, the C40, the top 40 cities in the world, led by Mayor Bloomberg and former President Clinton, are leading on how to cut emissions and to fight climate change, because they're not going to wait for the federal government. You know, if you're New York or you're San Francisco or you're LA, you need to do something now. So there are more and more opportunities, and I would say get as much experience in different sectors as you can. Think about how you're going to be part of bringing together nonprofit, private sector, and government actors together to work on global problems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Slaughter. Dr. Slaughter has graciously agreed to sign some books, and I'm sure if you sneak in a little small question here and there, she'd be happy to do that too, and that's over there. As you may know, March is Women's Month, and the Institute for Women's Leadership has a full month of programming planned. One highlight will be a keynote address from Dr. Terare Trent on women's leadership. So we invite you all back to the Gorecki Center during that month of March and all over campus on that month of March, and particularly for Dr. Trent's lecture on March 21st. So thank you very, very much.